All right. Welcome, everyone, to our September APPA Agora. I'm your host, Lou Marinoff, as I'm sure you know by now. And today we welcome a very special guest, my dear friend and colleague, and a great pioneer of philosophical practice who really needs no introduction. But Vaughana, so glad to have you. Welcome. Welcome to our Agora today.
Thank you.
Really great that you could manage to be here. And so far, we'll keep our fingers crossed about the internet connection. Hope everything holds up for the meeting. I want to ask a number of questions of you for the first part, as usual, and then I'll be happy to open the mic. People can raise their electronic hands or jump in and then we can hear from everyone. I'm sure that lots of people will want to ask things of you and get advice from you and learn things. So we'll give everyone a chance to interact. But let's go back. I mean, I just want to let people know, Vaughana, we've been friends and colleagues now for, I shouldn't say how long, but it's almost 30 years. We met in July of 1994 in Vancouver at the first international conference. And that was our first point of contact, and ever since we've done many things together in conjunction with our other APPA colleagues and other people in the movement. So what a fantastic debut we had. And you were doing practice before the Vancouver conference, right? You were already well ensconced. Yeah, what were you doing when you arrived in Vancouver in 1994? How much practice had you already been engaged in?
Well, I'd already been practicing for about 2 years, but mainly in business contexts. So I hadn't done individual counseling of any kind. And I had also done some work in prisons in New Orleans at that time.
So let's go back then, okay? Because you did your PhD at Arizona, yes?
Yes, that's correct.
In those days, that I mean, it still is. It's a very good university and a strong philosophy department. You must have been one of the only women at that time. Is that fair to say?
Yes, I was. I was the only woman in the PhD program, and it's funny because I just came up with a very funny photograph recently of a seminar at Tulane. I had gone to a phenomenology seminar there because U of A was mainly, we were the first actually to have a combined JD PhD program. And I had started in the JD program, but then we had to move, so I wasn't able to complete it. But I wanted some phenomenology, so I took that at Tulane, where they had some very good people. So anyway, but I was the only one in the class and only woman in the seminar. And everybody else had beards, and I was wearing these. I was right at the time of the second Wounded Knee demonstrations, so I was wearing my Indian regalia and so forth in honor of my ex. So it was very funny.
So did they treat you okay? I mean, did you? I know a lot of women of our vintage who were almost the only ones in their graduate programs back in the day, the pioneers of that breakthrough, and they weren't always well treated. Were you well treated down there?
Oh, yes, I was very well treated. No problems with that at all. As a matter of fact, it was a very, very collegial atmosphere, just very nice. The only problem I had was that I don't think that my professors understood some of the problems of women at that particular period. We didn't have the mobility, so we were trying to deal with dual careers. It was a problem. And my ex at that time was making 16 times more than I could possibly make, and as an assistant professor. So obviously I wasn't going to be trailing all over the country. He wasn't going to be trailing all over the country after me. So that's one reason that I was kind of interested in originally in the professional dimension of philosophical practice, because I thought it gave women more alternatives, and not just women now, because men and women are juggling those dual career issues. So, this gives them another option beside an academic position if they have to move.
Sure, but so you were exposed to more or less an analytic-based tradition in Arizona, but also you did phenomenology. So you had some of the continental influence at the same time. And I'm personally glad that we're very grateful that you didn't complete your JD, because we have enough. I mean, we always need good lawyers, but we always need more philosophers, I think. And so I'm sort of glad, that you stuck with philosophy. So what was your first point of contact with practice? How did you, what was the trigger, if you like, that got you into doing practical things?
Well, I've always had an interest, of course, in the application of philosophy to daily life. And the particular areas that I've been interested in have come out of my own personal experience. I was very active in the civil rights struggle. So, of course, my prison work was a continuation to some extent of that work. Also, I had a member of my family that was, as a child in my family who was killed in a violent crime. And so I was very interested, of course, and felt passionately about making sure that did not happen to another family. So I was interested both from the inmate point of view and from the victim point of view in my prison work. And then I got into my practice with cancer patients the hard way. I had cancer twice. So I was interested in helping others survive and thrive under those conditions. So those were two of the immediate things.
And we'll come back. I want to come back to both of those with you, but your family is also very interesting. And are you not also descended from Russian roots? I mean, you have some Russian pedigree.
Yes, my father was Russian.
Well,
and
that's
also
pretty much
a philosopher at Columbia at one point.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
Wow. I don't think I ever knew that.
He also taught classics, and then he later went to work for the Naval Academy, teaching Russian language and Russian culture for diplomats.
And when did he come to the U.S.?
He came after the Russian Revolution. He was a great deal older than my mother. He's 22 years older than my mother. So he came right after the revolution. Well, not right after. He went to Estonia first with some Russian troops with a thought that they were going to rescue the Tsar, but unfortunately it never came to pass. So
that's really fascinating. So, I mean, you're telling us basically your father was White Russian. May he rest.
Yes.
Obviously, yes. White Russian.
Yes.
But you yourself have some affinity for Marx, do you not? He's one of your favorite philosophers on your
one of my favorites. One of your favorites.
So this makes you immediately very unique. You're a kind of White Russian Marxist. This is very interesting conjunction of views. And what about New Orleans? Did you is this where you acquired your wonderful taste for good food and good wine and joy of life and all that, or did you have that already?
Oh, I had that already. I had that already.
Okay, so prison work was the first practice you did, because you also navigate corporate culture. You're one of the few philosophers who's comfortable in the corporate world, and you've done all kinds of different trainings in that ethos. So you're really quite multi-talented. But was prison work your first entry point into philosophical practice?
No, I had started doing some individual counseling. And of course, I was working, as many of you I'm sure do, I had worked with students. They had come to me with various problems, and I realized that I was using philosophy as a basis, of course, for counseling them, particularly as I taught a lot of social ethics courses. And so people would come to me with problems related to those areas. And so I guess you could say I really started with students, although I had done, as I say, quite a bit of organizational work and using more ethics. I had done some public relations work in New Orleans that was based on ethical issues as well, environmental issues and so on.
Well, you do have this other facet and this plank in your CV about the Excalibur Center for Applied Ethics, which you founded. So yeah, we share that applied ethics background in addition to the other things. So But I mean, in terms of, well, how did you get into prison work then? What what was the first time that you actually set foot in a prison to work with inmates of a correctional facility?
Well, actually, I had done some work in New Orleans with literacy, and also with some volunteer work in prisons, and working with some counseling. And then when I moved to New Jersey, I taught a philosophy of law and criminal justice ethics course, and at Fairleigh Dickinson. And so I had quite a few police officers and correctional officers in one of my classes in the criminal justice ethics component. And they had talked to somebody in the local jail in Morris County Correctional Facility. And it turned out that the program director there had been to Harvard and had just taken a course from Lawrence Kohlberg, and was very interested in moral development of offenders. So she called me and asked me if I would provide a program for an inmate program at Morris County Correctional Facility. And so I didn't know anything about correctional education at that time. So I immediately checked out resources, and went to a correctional education conference and met quite a few wardens there who are looking for new ideas in correctional programming, and particularly for women who were very underprogrammed at that time. So I began doing quite a bit of work, not only for Morris County, but for prisons throughout New Jersey, and then in other states as well, from solicited work that was asked of me by wardens that I had met at some of these conferences.
So word got out then that you were doing this, and there's obviously a great need for it, because whatever else they were doing wasn't sufficient. What about the cold, hard statistics? Do you think that, I mean, there are two ways that your work in prisons is obviously going to have impact. I mean, I know that we all work on the basis of changing one mind at a time. We're working with consciousness. We're trying to change consciousness, and we can do this, and all of us do it. But what about the recidivism rates? What about statistics? What about evidence-based outcomes? You must have had to provide, there must have been surveys and other things instruments that you had to apply. Did you invent all this, or reinvent it? Or how did you measure your success rate with these programs?
Well, I'm afraid it takes more than philosophical counseling to reduce recidivism. These are multidimensional problems. And at most, I was able to show with evidence-based material that that inmates in my programs had fewer disciplinary incidents. And that was a major selling point to correctional facilities. Truthfully, I'm not sure that it's like many of the tests showing that one type of counseling is better than another in psychotherapy. I question whether those tests are very valid. As far as reducing recidivism is concerned, I do believe, I mean, there are many statistics that show that the more education that offenders have, the longer it takes them to recidivate. So, 5 years is one of the estimates for somebody for each year of education. So, that's very good right there. I do think that it reduces in the populations that I saw return, they had lesser offenses, and they seem to be doing better on the outside than they had been doing before. The absence of support facilities after release, of course, is the big problem. And so, as far as coming up with wonderful statistics as to what philosophers can do, I'm afraid that's not to the point. But there is evidence that cognitive-based programs do much better than other types of programs. The Ross and Fabriano program in Canada has a lot of statistical support for that, and it's basically critical reasoning. So we have no way of tracking recidivism in New Jersey. So you don't even have this, having the statistics is just not available.
Well,
So,
maybe that's a
the
blessing in
tasting.
disguise in a way. But I take your point that the wardens and the various guards would be thrilled just to have less violence in situ. Anything that you could do to improve behavior among the population would be a blessing for them, clearly. And then word gets out. But you didn't confine yourself to this. Did you also, I mean, you worked in, this sounded like the initial point was a state lockup. Yeah, it was a county jail or something. Did you, but then you've been involved with other kinds of institutions too, yes?
Yes, correctional institutions.
Yes.
Oh, yes. But Morris County is a maximum security facility. So you have murderers and so on that go on to state there. So, just because it's a jail does not mean that it's, you have minor offenders. I did, however, work in state prisons. I worked in Northern State Prison and quite a few others, and many in Oklahoma when I was giving programs. So.
Well, you're one of the few, though, still, I think, we know internationally that, Leon DeHaas, the late Leon DeHaas, worked in prisons a lot in Holland with his team, and Horst Gronke in Berlin, we know very well. And now, Pepe and David Sumiaker, they're working in some very tough prisons in Mexico and Colombia. Yeah. And hats off to them for doing this. Do you think, though, that it takes a special combination of let's say skills to be able to do this kind of work? I mean, I can't imagine that just any philosopher coming out of a university with a postgraduate degree is ready to set foot in a correctional facility.
That's a hard question. I think just an interest in people is the big thing. An ability to care about the interests of and ideas of all sorts of different people with different educational backgrounds. That's part of it. I guess in part, I had kind of an unusual background in many ways because my parents very often were absentee for various reasons. And we had a man who worked for us who had a 6th grade education. And yet I learned more probably from him than I did from my own parents about many things. So I think that made me perhaps more respectful of people with different educational levels. And many offenders are very, very bright people. And many of them are very gifted. It's literature, and many of them are good, excellent writers. Many of them are very interesting musicians and so on. So you just have a receptivity, I guess, to the strengths of other people, I guess, is the main characteristic.
Well, I think you've demonstrated that pretty much across the board. But you've worked with critical thinking kinds of modalities, but you've also done art therapy, isn't it? So you've done, I mean, you have this great interest in literature and poetry, and you've implemented that with in correctional facilities as well.
Yes, I have a certification in poetry therapy as well on an elementary level, and I use poetry a great deal in my work with patients and with hospital patients and with offenders and with individual counseling. I also use it occasionally in corporate environments, but not as much, of course.
Right. So when did you begin with the cancer programs that you ran? Obviously, it was after you had recovered initially. Was this early in this century that you began to do that?
Yes, I began work with the cancer patients in 1999, actually when I was diagnosed with cancer. And I took some programs at the local hospital, became very friendly with, and then I had some students who were also social workers at the hospital. And so they asked me to do something philosophically with some of the programs. So I did, and then I was asked to do a whole program. So that was while I was still ill. So it was interesting.
And you have, of course, you've written about this, and in addition to all this other work that you do in so many arenas, you have found time to publish really interesting papers. You always say you want to write more, but you're so busy with so many commitments. I'm amazed how you get everything done. Are you continuing to work with cancer patients, or is this now shifted because you've also started doing psychiatric interventions and working with homeless and refugees? So are you able to spin all these plates, or do you focus on one at a time?
Well, I had been focusing on one at a time, but um, I've I've really been overburdened, I think. So I'm trying to take some time off and recharge my batteries a little bit. I want to do some new things. I'm always interested in pioneering new areas in counseling. And so once I have some idea of what the problems are and have published an article on it, then I'm interested in moving on. I like to do new things. And I think also if you work in one area for too long, you lose your creative impulses to try new things. You tend to do the same old thing again and again, and that's not good. So I've met a lot of people with other medical problems, and through my cancer counseling and hospital work. And I'm interested in working with heart patients, and I'm also interested in working with people with brain trauma. I think that's a very interesting area of philosophical counseling. I also like working with people with disabilities. I enjoy working with people who are blind. I'm just beginning in the past few years to really understand some of the philosophical problems of the blind and their being in the world and their orientation to the world. And I have a big farm in New Jersey, so I have some blind clients who come here and work their dogs. And I have a big collection of African sculpture, so they enjoy working with sculpture and working with artistic issues. So we do a lot of counseling around that. But that's a very small part of my counseling work. But that's one of the new things that I'm sort of experimenting with a bit.
And this tremendous taste you have for literature, poetry, and art, this is acquired over the years, and you've traveled the world in the meantime. Not only have you done all these things, but I mean, everywhere I've been, you were there before, and brought home art. In case there's a shortage, anyone's experiencing a shortage, Vaughana has the art. So, were these things acquired over time? Your aesthetic values, is this something you basically soaked up?
Well, I've always had an interest in art. I paint myself, not well, but excuse me, but I do paint. And I like to experiment with sculpture sometimes. So I particularly like African art. I spent quite a bit of time in Africa, and I had a wonderful time traveling around to the villages. Anthropology is a big interest of mine as well. So, and I at one time had a small African art business in partnership with somebody, and I really enjoyed that.
That's phenomenal, Vaughana. And you recently, I remember a paper not that long ago about Elizabethan literature, and I mean that's a whole other period. Did you study Shakespeare somewhere, or was this another acquired taste?
Well, that was just an enthusiasm of mine because, of course, he's such a deeply philosophical writer. And so I had a wonderful time with that. And I was very interested to see what Shakespeare was doing with the so-called tradition of the speaking picture and philosophical counsel. And so many of his with his work with Neoplatonic iconography, he manages to convey so much about Platonic and Neoplatonic themes. And so I found that very, very interesting. And I had a lot of fun writing the article on Othello, which is so much a play about sacred and profane love, but also so many people, so many critics have said that it's a play about a bed. And actually it is that. It's a play about a bed for the groundlings, but it also is a wonderful philosophical play with metaphysical and epistemological and aesthetic dimensions to it, which are, I think, ignored largely by people who don't look at the Neoplatonic iconography in the play. So I had a lot of fun with that. It's a big puzzle and a lot of fun to work with.
That's great. You published that in our journal, I think. Is that
Yes,
right?
I did. Yes,
I
did.
would recommend our audience to go to the APPA site and enter your name in the search bar of the journal page, and you'll pull up all your articles in that one too. That's really fantastic one. So let me switch gears for a moment and ask you a bit about leadership from your perspective, because you are a leader and you have been in so many different ways, not just a pioneer, which itself is something, but you were past president of the ASPCP, and that was an election. I mean, and you also are, of course, a co-founder of APPA, and have always consistently given wonderful strategic and business and other kinds of advice to the board. We don't always listen to you, but we should. Your advice is usually right on point. And then you founded this, Excalibur Center for Applied Ethics, as if you don't have enough to do. But these are all leadership positions. What's your philosophy of leadership?
I don't know whether I think of myself as a leader. I do programs on leadership for corporations, but usually that's facilitating groups, and I'm listening to executives talking about their theories of leadership and relating to those and tying them in with various philosophical ideas. I don't know whether I have a philosophy of leadership as such myself. I think I have learned a great deal from the people that I have worked with. And I think that's tremendously important, is to listen to the ideas of those people and try and facilitate the development of those ideas. Excalibur grew about in a rather interesting way. I was teaching business ethics, and I had a number of AT&T people working for me. And of course, AT&T, particularly in the old days, had such a wonderful corporate ethic and corporate sense of corporate responsibility. And so I was doing a segment in my business ethics course on crime. So I had a collaborative class session with my business ethics class and my Fairleigh Dickinson business ethics class. So they had a very interesting discussion with inmates about the difficulties that offenders had securing jobs afterward and how that contributed to recidivism. And so, of course, my AT&T people, being, very much business leaders, immediately wanted to do something about it. And so they got some money from AT&T, and they kind of twisted my arm until I developed a nonprofit for them to work with. So, and then I began doing collaborative class sessions with some of my feminist philosophy students. And so they wanted to get involved in prison programs for that reason, and with women's programs of various sorts. So it grew like topsy. So I was mainly writing the grants for those programs, because it takes quite a bit of money to do adequate volunteer coordination. And so that was really my function in running the philosophical dimensions of the programs, because the programs were all philosophically based. So
that's another feather in your cap, this business of knowing how to write grant proposals and raise money. Once again, I think relatively very few philosophers either have an interest in doing this. We all want to spend money, but we're not very good at raising the humanities notoriously is underfunded, and a lot of humanities scholars, unless they're in a big visible industry like film, they will have problems with grant raising too. But you've done that. I think, Vaughana, that your track record of leadership within the movement and in facilitating for business leaders and so forth demonstrates that you are a leader, because I think leaders, from my own experience, leaders will respect other leaders as facilitators. But if we have typically in the universities a lot of professors in business schools, as you know, who teach entrepreneurship, but they aren't really entrepreneurs. If you want to teach entrepreneurship, you want to bring an entrepreneur in to do it, surely. And I think the same applies to leadership. So I would say you have leadership skills, and maybe these things, maybe leaders tend to be born with that skill set and polish it, hopefully, over time. But I think you've demonstrated that. Let me ask you a different question about philosophical practice and your vision for the future. Do we have a bright future? Do we have more opportunity than ever before 30 years in? Are we in a good place? What's your view?
Oh, I think we have a wonderful potential for philosophical practice. And I think we're doing very well right now. I see a lot of very talented young philosophers and older philosophers who are doing extremely good work and extending their practices. I think certainly the APPA, and with your leadership, particularly, Lou, has expanded opportunities with the website and with the chat and so forth. And of course, since COVID, where everybody is doing everything online, this has expanded possibilities for us. I would like to see philosophical practice expand in new directions. I think it's not simply a matter of marketing, and I don't think it's just simply a matter of expanding our presence online, although that's part of it. I think, I see some tendency sometimes that we are confined to, not confined, but perhaps influenced by psychological models, despite the fact that we're very critical of psychology. We think that counseling has to be done in an office somewhere with one person and so forth. I don't like that individualizing trend that psychology promotes. That's one thing I like about counseling from feminist perspectives, although I'm not a feminist philosopher. It's just one tool in my toolbox. I think the notion that the personal is the political, well, it's the political, but it's a lot of other things too. I think problems are multidimensional, and I think we need to address those multidimensional problems. I also think that I hope we don't get too influenced by psychology's insistence upon evidence-based counseling. I don't think half the evidence is worth much anyway that they come up with. Most of their tests, I think, are really very unsatisfactory. But I think, of course, we have to show the instrumental value of philosophy and philosophical counseling to others. But I don't think we need to, it's important that we don't lose sight of the fact that philosophy is intrinsically valuable and philosophical dialogue is intrinsically valuable. And so I would like to see more cooperation with other disciplines, and I would like to see, I think we need to give up the assumption that philosophy alone is enough to be a good counselor. I think we need to develop multidisciplinary skills, particularly if we're going to work in institutions. And I think that's where the future of philosophical practice expanding is going to be. We need to, I think, to address social problems, the big social problems in this country, from at least in America, and I think elsewhere, the criminal justice system, the mental health system, I mean, our psychiatric hospitals are just a mess, and our whole mental health system needs reform. That's a big area of my interest, philosophical intervention with psychiatric patients. And I think we need to deal with homeless, immigration, all of those refugee issues. And if we're working in those particular areas, I think that can be very helpful. And I think we have done a wonderful job with criticism of both psychiatry and psychology. Nobody could be more critical than I am of those two disciplines. Those of you who have been in training sessions with me know what my criticisms are and that I share with most of you. At the same time, however, I don't think that this adversarial stance with those professions are necessarily helpful. I don't think we can really do a good job counseling psychiatric patients, and psychiatric patients, like everybody else, have philosophical problems. And we can do a wonderful job with them in outpatient programs. But we can't do that unless we understand the mental health system and we understand what the problems of psychiatric patients are. And we're not going to get that information from books. We're going to get them from working in those institutions. Same with substance abuse. I don't do substance abuse counseling, but I do philosophical counseling with substance abusers in rehabs. And there's a tremendous call for that kind of thing. And we can expand philosophical practice that way, and having philosophers working in hospitals and so forth. But, and I think a lot of the future of the expansion of philosophical practice will be in those areas.
Well, I really admire your vision and your conviction and your example, because you're not just talking the talk, you've done all these things. It seems like our challenge then is to facilitate, not just to train philosophers to do X, Y, or Z in practical terms, but to facilitate better lines of communication and mutual understanding between, let's say, philosophy graduates who have these kinds of interests in the social, in the political, and the existing institutions that pretty much know they need help anyway. And they're not going to get fixed by the government. They're not going to get fixed internally either necessarily. So I think I share your view that there are opportunities aplenty, but current postgraduate philosophy education, the standard kinds of education that people are receiving in very good philosophy departments. I'm not speaking about political indoctrination in the universities. I mean, just a very good graduate program in philosophy, and there are many. This is still necessary, but not sufficient. Yes. I mean, if philosophers early on are made aware, if philosophy students are made more aware of the opportunities outside the academy, then they may be interested in taking courses. And do you see it as initially course-based in a university, that practitioners have to come in and literally teach people how to liaise with these other professions and institutions? Is that how it's going to work?
Well, to some extent, I think we as we train philosophical practitioners, however, we need to, and I think you and I try very hard in our training to encourage them to rely on their own creativity and innovation. I mean, you can. There's no formula for getting your foot inside a prison to do a program. I mean, yes, I mean, I can make suggestions. You come up with a proposal and you go and see the program director, and or you do some volunteer work and meet some of the program staff, and you could, there are various little things that you can do. But I mean, selling yourself is an individual task. And I think philosophers of some philosophy graduate students, you come out of a traditional PhD program and you think the only thing you can do is go to the APA and interview for an academic job. There are other things that you can do. And with with a certification in philosophical practice, I think we need to encourage people to do those entrepreneurial things for themselves.
Indeed, indeed. But this means that we have a lot more work to do, Vaughana. It's just we've just begun then, if that's the case. We've been at this for 30 years and more, but we're only just beginning now to realize what opportunities there are. So I think that's a very optimistic position and a very insightful one. And I hope that we'll continue with APPA to play our role in helping to facilitate getting more philosophers into the real spaces where they're needed. As well as the reflective spaces. You remember that line from the Dutch conference back in 2010 that we're only at home at the edge. Practitioners are where you're still someone who's immersed in the vita contemplativa, but also with one big footprint in the vita activa, and that's how we feel who we are. We have to be doing both. And we will hopefully attract more able philosophers from the contemplative traditions who also have this urge and this ability to be active in society. And I think we have a lot that can be accomplished yet. So I hope you'll stick around and be part of this journey for a long time to come.
Well,
I want to open the floor and ask if folks have questions or comments, or if anyone wants to interact with you, then, well, Ibrahim, welcome. Your hand is up already. So please go ahead, unmute yourself.
Ibrahim?
Yes.
Good
afternoon. Good afternoon. It is good to see Vaughana, again with her health and inspiration, and especially I thank you for this really inspiring talk and a lot of experiences in the field. I'm especially interested in your experience in the prison, because as I got my certificate, I also contacted, I talked with a chaplain in a prison here, and when I talk about philosophical counseling, he said, "What are you doing?" Then I explained it in some details. Then he talked with the prison administration. No, they invited me to give, talk about with the inmates, especially they as I am Muslim, they say we have more than 100 Muslim inmates, and how you can help them. Mm-hmm. No, I am preparing my notes to help them. And I wonder what is the specific questions they have in prison. It is health problems, it is psychological problems, it is philosophical problems, it is about the meaning of the life, or what else? I want to hear more about that from you. Thank you.
Well, I'm very interested to hear about your work, Ibrahim, and you've brought up an interesting point too. You're working with a chaplain, and that's one way to get your foot in the door. That is, I started working in one psychiatric hospital with a chaplain. It's, there are all kinds of restrictions on who can go in a psychiatric hospital and so forth. So, this was very, very good way to start. Now, as far as what issues I think are the main issues, I think that you will hear correctional officers very often saying to offenders, particularly if there's they're not doing anything productive. And if officers will say, "Oh, take responsibility for your own life." And I don't think that most offenders have any conception of what responsibility is all about. And one of the things I found when I first started working with them was that, you have these utilitarian retributive theories of punishment and so forth. And it sounds wonderful, if you're working with sentencing reform, as I have with the court sometimes. But both of them assume that those theories are going to be effective. But neither one of them are effective because offenders are not really responsible for their behavior. So fully responsible. And because they don't have the competencies usually. you don't have to have a deterministic point of view just to think that they're not responsible. So rather than look at free will issues, if you look at what competencies do people need to become fully responsible for their behavior? Well, for one thing, they need to be able to manage whatever disorders, or if there are substance abuse problems, psychological problems, personality problems. They need to be able to deal with those disorders, take their medication or whatever, to be able to manage their disorders, whatever they happen to be. That's one thing. They also need to have some critical reasoning. Most of them have enormous cognitive rigidity. They can't envision alternatives. They have poor consequential reasoning. They have very illogical reasoning. So critical reasoning is a big issue. They need to learn to manage and modulate their emotions. And I mean, philosophers have a lot to say about emotion. Wonderful papers on that. Certainly, they need to develop a secure sense of self. And that's something we can help with identity issues. And there are all kinds of other issues that you can deal with as well. I mean, spirituality, I think, is very helpful. Philosophers can add a great deal to, inmates and offenders are all take their substance abuse programs, but they get tired of hearing the same old thing from AA and from their substance abuse programs, whereas we have some wonderful traditions, philosophical traditions of spirituality, which can be shared with inmates. And of course, giving them hope and discussing what hope is all about is a very useful thing. So there are so many, and of course, relationships. That's a big issue. So many, probably the most likely type of recidivism is, either they get on drugs when they get out, but usually a relationship of some sort falls apart because they're going home to a situation that's been difficult for them. And of course, they've been away for a while, particularly if they've been in state prison. And so immediately their relationships begin to fall apart. So teaching them some moral principles about duties, parenting, respect for other people. Those are all issues that I think philosophers can be very helpful with.
So, Vaughana, you've already given Ibrahim the seeds of 5 different programs he could run. And don't forget Rumi, and give them some
Rumi, yes. I mean, your Rumi,
especially you, Ibrahim.
Yes,
such a great.
Rumi therapy is wonderful. I think that's and poetry therapy, and that's a great way to start too with a program, because they will certainly relate to Rumi. Are you doing individual counseling, or are you doing groups?
No, presently I'm doing individual online, but I am surprised, people, I am giving in Turkish from America, from Europe to Australia. They said we are the first time we are having, somebody who is giving us philosophical counseling. And the most important thing I say, I tell them they are not sick. They don't have any mental problems. They only have healthy problems, healthy questions. What they need is to talk to a philosophical counselor. And so far it's so good. So far it's so good. And we have some interviews in Turkey. I translated some of your works into Turkish. I will send the links to the Lou soon, I hope. Okay. It is so far so good. I am very happy to be with you, to know you, and also to engage this, to be a member of APPA.
Well,
we're so glad to have you a part of our community too.
Thank you.
You add so much.
Thank you. You're a great pioneer, and also you're going to be doing a power of good in Turkey as well as everywhere else. So thank you very much for joining us today. Karen, Patricia, Rick, your hands are all up. Let's go to Karen. Okay, Karen, please unmute. Unmute yourself, Karen.
There we go. Okay. I am a social worker as well as a philosopher. And I always say prison is not my cup of tea. I've done mental health. I've done hospice, which is a couple of crossovers of the things you've been saying. But the question I have is for a philosopher in a research class and getting a master's in social work. I was in this research class and this professor's teaching the research, and we're talking about quantity and quality. And I said, some things cannot be reduced to quantity. A lot of things are qualitative. If you were an Aristotelian, different category. And she said, I pressed this point, and finally she said, well, that's nice, but let's move on, or something to that effect. So I wonder if you have any comment on that, given, we're so in teaching everywhere, we have to rate somebody with a 4.5 and whatever, 4 or 5, everything is quantitative. And what does that do to what the real, how to report on whether something is successful? If everything has to be reduced to a number, I think it's messed up from the get-go as far as I see, because we're stuck in this quantitative world when it's not quantitative.
Yes, I agree with you. And that's why I don't want to see us get locked into this evidence-based counseling. I saw that happening with wilderness therapy, and it perverted the whole enterprise. I think the answer is that we have to be, as near as we can, to be pragmatic. And of course, we do have to come up with, evaluation procedures for when we write grants, and whatever we think of them, we can, the psychologists are very good. I'm sure you have psychology colleagues that can come up with some test to prove almost anything you do is wonderful. And, and then ignore it when you're doing your work. I think that's the best advice I could give you. I mean, you're not going to convince anybody in your field with that, because the psychology, all the mental health professionals want all these tests for everything and evidence that this is the way to go.
And I agree with you. I'm suspicious about the meaning and so forth of a lot of things, and it's one beautiful anecdote or description of how somebody found happiness or blah blah blah, whatever. Anecdotal evidence, qualitative evidence is very powerful, but people have no time for it and they want numbers. So yeah, I understand you have to kind of get along with people on that one, but you have to deal with real people, but always keep in mind the ideal. For all philosophers.
I certainly agree, and I'm so glad to see a social worker who's interested in philosophy and using philosophical practice techniques, because I think social workers are wonderful clinicians. I think you're much better than the psychologists.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Yeah. May I
At least the ones I worked with. When I do quite a lot of collaborative work with social workers, because before I formed those relationships, I was doing social work very badly. Cancer patients would say, oh, I'm having trouble with, this or that problem with insurance or, follow-up procedures or whatever. And so working with social workers, and of course, certainly when I'm working with certain populations like psychiatric or homeless or whatever, obviously the social workers who are working with those populations are a wealth of information for us, can provide us with a wealth of education. So that's the kind of collaborative thing that I'm talking about, where it's not enough to know philosophy when you go into a homeless shelter. You need to talk to the social workers who are working with those populations and learn what's going on. So, well,
Absolutely, absolutely. Yes.
so thank
Karen,
you.
let me just reinforce what you've said and what Vaughana has said, and we'll move on to Pierre, who's up next. Actually, I'm looking at the virtual hands, but Pierre is in reality, which I missed. So we'll come to you next, Pierre. But Karen, this is a widespread problem, you know, and for example, the general populations of students in universities are really based on the instrumentality. What they do is they value instrumentally what is happening. What is this going to get me? You know, what is this good for? Those are the questions. Inherent value is lost on them. We have now instituted, I refuse to do it, but we've instituted in our university extra credit incentives to get students to go to cultural events or to seminars or to colloquia or to anything that might actually add inherent value to their education. They won't do it unless they have to win a prize to do it. It's really awful. And I think you fingered something really important, and that's where we can help a lot, I think, is restoring people's understanding in the value of value inherently. But that's swimming against the current at the moment, but keep up the good work. Okay. Thanks again for joining. Pierre, please.
Yes.
I'm going to let you in, Pierre, because you've got a real hand up. So please go for it.
It turns out that we started a class at San Quentin Jail in the 50s. It was a school we called it Philosophy, Psychology, and Religion. And that got me involved. I was totally involved in it for several years. By the way, one of my students later did a work called Soul on Ice.
Eldridge Cleaver? Wow.
Eldridge
He was one of your students?
and I only had one real teaching. I said, hey, we have to become as real as we are, as we should be, and what we could be. And there isn't anything more important than emerge as a self, a true self. But from that, I decided, for several reasons, to go into social work. So I also went into social work. And in San Francisco in those days, the lowest level of social work were people working with chronic alcoholics. And no one wanted to do it. I said, I'll do it. I'm very glad to. Many people in my family were alcoholics. And so I got involved in that. And that became the basis for philosophical midwifery, because I worked with people there at a rehabilitation center, the first one in Redwood City. And all I had was blackboards. And each time one of the alcoholics would return, I'd say, I don't have anything to teach you, but let's just put on the board what you can recall on your last drunk. And from this emerged meaningful patterns, and breakthrough came, and that became the basis for Alcibiades, my first dialogue. So, hey, same background. And then I thought the best thing to do with my explorations was to see the upper reach of philosophy, which is the Neoplatonic philosophy. And that is what I have been involved in. But what I enjoy most when I reflect upon our basic relationship, Vaughana, was you were the first person who went into public way back in the 90s. You were the volunteer that emerged from the audience.
Yes.
For philosophical midwife talk. So again,
Yes.
I want to thank you from that beginning, and I love your stories, and especially since we talk about the most important things, right? Which is the role of reason and the role of man are one. and mankind is one, and we have to return to our basic being, and that is philosophical midwifery. So going back, it's your turn.
Well, Pierre, you've been an inspiration to me, and you were certainly it was one of the first conferences that I had been to in philosophical practice. The first one was in Vancouver, but I remember being a volunteer in your when you were giving a demonstration, and it has always stuck with me, and you've always been an inspiration. So thank you so much for that, and you've been an inspiration to everyone.
And you still are, Pierre. I remember doing dream work with you in Costa Mesa. I volunteered for one of your demonstrations, and I'll never forget it. So anyway, we'll get together again soon, I hope. Okay, I'm overdue to visit you on the West Coast, so we'll talk. But thank you so much for joining and for sharing. Always wonderful. I'm going to take moderator's privilege and invite Lydia to jump in because it's very late where she is, and she told me already she might not stay because it's too late. So let's let Lydia.
Thank you for
hear
being here, Lydia.
Still up and at 'em. Okay, go ahead, Lydia. Please unmute yourself. Thanks again, Pierre. We'll be in touch. Okay.
Right on.
So, Lou, you're really telepathic. I am tired here, and I wanted to honor Vaughana and to be present. And I was, as usual, surprised, by your acumen and your personality. And leadership does not entirely describe it. There is something more about you. Now, I'm saddened by the idea that your capacity in various fields would get lost because nobody would look for all these articles that are scattered. So I really think that if you take these ideas with someone else, another author, or with an assistant that will help you, you make each chapter, you make an anthology of one person. Each chapter, another topic that a philosopher can and should meddle in. And you call that book the collaborative philosophy. And as you have articles about the main problems of each field, hospital, prison, addiction, various diseases, the disabilities, all that. And so first the problems, because you have, as you said, articles on that. And then your own experience, what worked, what didn't work, so that you leave us a living legacy while you live. I'm not talking about another end. People need that. It's true that we all need originality and chutzpah, but we don't need to begin from scratch. This is how humanity never advances, each one beginning from scratch. There is a lot of experience here. And if you would add, in each field, the social workers are doing that, the others are doing that. This would be a wonderful book that everybody would use. We need that legacy and your experience. So please do it.
Well, thank you. I'm losing my picture here somewhat. Thank you very much for being here, Lydia, and thank you for the suggestion. I'll think about it. I appreciate your invitation, and you do so much with all your editing and with Lexington and all of that. It's wonderful. We all are deeply indebted to you. I work much better with the article than I do with the long book.
But Lydia, you're now giving Vaughana a recipe for how to write books.
Yes. Yes.
I've been trying to convince Vaughana to write a book for years, and I utterly failed to do so. But you have now shined a light on the way in which Vaughana could actually do it. And Vaughana, you should also know that Lydia, who is also extremely busy, is editing a series of books on philosophical practice.
Oh, yes.
This book that she is now describing that you could actually write would be something she could publish. Yes?
Yes. And I want to say, Aura, that did not write a book all her life, now has a book published. A book is simply a set of chapters. Each chapter is another article. It's very easy. Don't think about it as a book. It's an anthology by various authors. put your picture on the front and one of your painting, and do this for us, not for you. And take any help for all the APPA. You know, everyone would help in another chapter. We'll make it a collaborative work of various philosophers to do that. And it's not daunting. Even if there are a few chapters, that's enough. And if you don't want with your name because you may be too humble or ashamed, take another name. That's okay. You know, but I think we really need the legacy and the experience. So, and it needs not be in the series I'm editing. If you want another place to show you that this is with no interest, absolutely. You can take any other place you want.
That's beautiful, Lydia. And we have you on tape now saying this. So I think you're going to help us to convince Vaughana to do this, and it'll be really worthwhile. So thank you so much for
thank you very much. I'm flattered that you're inviting me to do that and saying that it's so important and all that. So I have about 5 projects on the burner, but I will try and get to that eventually. So, but thank you so much.
Yes.
Your insights.
So elegant in refusing that. Wonderful. It's okay. It's okay. Well, it's the second time I try. Thank you so much for a wonderful talk. Thank you.
Oh, thank you for being here.
Thank you, Lydia, for joining us. Okay, Patricia and Rick, you've been so patient, Patricia.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Please, Patricia, go ahead and unmute.
Vaughana, thank you a lot for your talk. Of course, you have been inspiring as usual. I remember you at my first course for APPA in 2012. And so I loved your talk there, and I love it now as well. So thank you a lot. And even, and the suggestion of Lydia, I mean, I don't want to go back, but this is a very good suggestion, because really having all your articles put together in one anthology, and with some person who make the editing. I'm an editor as well, so sometimes I put in order what other people write, and for my publisher. So really, it's an easier work than you thought to reason in a longer space instead of a small space and small number of words for an article. So really, it would be a great legacy, as Lydia said, a great legacy really for all of us. So this is a good suggestion that I feel to repeat. And then going back very, very briefly to your experience in prison, I think that, I can share all the things you said. I've been working for some years in a prison near here in Padua. And an experience that I got from then, of course, I had to stop in 2017 because they changed director, and he was against the contact between philosophers and prisoners. So they just stopped. Now they have started again. But anyway, the things that I noticed is that even those prisoners who had just the elementary school or no school at all, because in Padua, the 70% of the prisoners are foreigners. So most of them, they don't speak Italian either. I mean, they have difficulty. But they, as soon as they are able enough to start questioning things about ethics and moral and existential problem, and reasoning about their own life and their own behavior and their own way to communicate with other people. As soon as they get to that point, they just start loving talking about philosophy, because they start from themselves, but then they go straight into philosophy, which is not at all psychology, because in the prison there are doctors, medical doctors, and psychologists and social workers. So they just approach philosophy as it is, and they don't need any kind of scholarization. I mean, they any kind of education. They just appreciate to reason in a philosophical way, and that's incredible. I mean, very, very simple people, foreigner people. I had people from Morocco or from Syria or from Egypt with a very low level of Italian. But as soon as I get to the text and I was explaining them the meaning of the text, like the dialogue Socrates, for example, they're short. And then they learn Italian and they start reading Socrates. So they start reading Crito and Phaedrus and Phaedrus, and we discussed about that. And they found a lot of things. So I always said to them, you are teaching me a lot of things. You are helping me. They were helping me to see and to understand some meanings in those dialogues that I didn't get before. So I think that philosophy can really help any kind of individual in distress. And of course, a prisoner is very hardly in distress, of course, because it's in jail, there is no freedom, and just the freedom of the thought, of course. They are free with their mind. And so I was teaching them to get free with their mind and their books. And then when they get out, they have more instruments, more tools. So I think that, the experience that you, I wanted to share this with you because you are on the same kind of vision, a transversional kind of a philosophy open to the real existence of the human being. Yeah.
Well, thank you. Thank you for sharing that, Patricia. And I'm sure that, offenders are getting a great deal out of their work with you. I listened to Lydia, and I will listen to you as well. Thank you for your willingness to inspire me along the lines of writing more. But
give us a book. Give us a book. Yeah.
All right. We'll see. Rick, I think you were next.
Yes, and you're not going to like this. I have two things to say. One of them was Lydia beat me to it. I was going to say, really need to write a book, but I thought you need to write a kind of biography about your incredible philosophical practice journey. I think it's a fantastic story. We hear snippets of it, but I think there's certainly a whole book-length version of it, which would be a wonderful thing, which is part of the legacy that Lydia is saying. Like, you have a whole thing. It shouldn't just become vague, fragmented memories someday when you're no longer here. I think you have a lot to give, and it should be saved. But I like Lydia's idea also about the anthology. That's a brilliant idea, and that's lower hanging fruit for you, as busy as you are. You've got all those published articles, maybe with some editor like Patrizia or Lydia or somebody, and a bunch of other articles from folks who you know who could write a chapter about this or that. You would be the guru of that book, even if you didn't want to be the editor. I would strongly encourage you to do that. So that's the one thing I wanted to say.
Thank you, Rick.
Books. And then the other thing, I was just curious, were you never afraid working in prisons as a woman?
No. It's very funny. Everybody is worried about that. The only time I was ever afraid was in the detention facility. But no, actually, the big thing is to try and get the officers to move far enough away from you so that you can have dialogue with the offenders. Because you're on camera, but it's a real problem. And of course, even in Attica, when they had the riots, inmates love the program staff, so they defended them to the hilt. So no, I'm not afraid of that. I was afraid when I was working in the detention facility. That was a whole different thing, because it was a clue when I went to. I didn't want to do that work because I don't like working with juveniles, but. Unfortunately, while I was out of town, the sheriff convinced my executive director of Excalibur that this was just what we needed to do. So when I went to the facility and all the staff were in riot gear, it was a clue that things were not going to go well. So it was very definitely the toughest. It was quite a jungle in there. So. That was the only time I was afraid. They had killed a counselor right before I went in, and that was the reason. Not purposely. The kids got in a fight, and was movable furniture, and they slammed a counselor over the head with the furniture. But that was why they wanted programs suddenly. So, and they particularly wanted Excalibur because I not only came in and did programs twice a week, trying to stay alive, but also because I brought in mentors from the corporate and academics sector. So we had one-on-one counseling in the cafeteria. So that was a civilizing influence, they thought. And it was. The mentors did a much better job than I did. I just,
Well, Vaughana, you are courageous, though. Rick is right. I think that it takes enormous courage to go into a facility where there's that kind of uncertainty, and the threat of violence is always, if it's not hanging in the air, it's certainly lurking in the background. So you've emerged from all that unscathed, but I think you were giving them something of such huge value that, as you said, their tendency would be rather to protect you as a valuable asset rather than take you as a hostage or something like that.
actually, I mean, the only time there was ever any danger in a correctional facility is when inmates get into a fights with each other. That's the big problem. And I was worried in the women's wing sometimes because they had 20 or 30 women in a area that was, you know, maybe designed for 15, and no air conditioning. So it was, people were, you know, on a short leash in there. But and I never had any problems with them attacking me. We had a few fights with each other, but fortunately, very few. I was very,
Say
very,
though, I'm incredibly impressed. Even if you weren't afraid, this is just a higher level of the virtue of courage, in my opinion. I don't think that you were oblivious to danger, but you know, congratulations to you. Very impressive.
thank you.
Thank you, Rick. We have Julia and Stefania, who've been very patient.
Oh,
and
I'm
we'll
sorry.
take turn.
Okay.
So Julia, please go ahead and unmute. Thanks, Rick, again. Julia,
Okay.
please go ahead and unmute. Go ahead.
Thank you.
You're on.
Okay, thank you. Vaughana, I was struck by your interest in the social work because, you know, in California here, I was reading that in some of the schools, they're replacing the counselors with social workers because they're realizing that a lot of the children's problems are not psychological problems with them, but they're problems in the home with the parents. So it's just got me thinking that philosophical counseling could have a role, you know, just maybe going into the family and just starting to talk about the beliefs that are in the home, just to get them to put words on it and articulate it. And it just would be, I think, an effective thing. They're using meditation in the schools with the younger children and finding that's very effective. So, you know, the kids I think it would help, philosophical counseling in the schools.
That's very interesting. I think both social work and philosophical counseling have enormous amounts of input that they could just deploy toward a family counseling. I've never done that kind of work. I just a couple times I have, again, in connection with a detention facility, kids that were, you know, I did some work with families, but that's not my strong point. I think that's a very interesting area of philosophical practice, and I don't think philosophical practitioners have yet begun to exploit the opportunities that are there for them in education. I think we could do an awful lot with the school system that we are not yet doing. I know that there's quite a few philosophers that have taught philosophy for children in the school system, but I think philosophical counseling would be very interesting as part of the departments, and certainly social workers would be very helpful in, you know, educating the philosophers about some of the needs of the kids that are in that school, in those schools.
What about in the social workers programs? Do they have any classes like philosophical counseling?
I know some social workers do study philosophy at some point. Some of them I wish had not studied philosophy. I've run into psychiatric social workers in crisis centers sometimes when I'm doing interventions who want to quote Foucault to me. That's not exactly welcome. I had one that was telling me, "Oh, you don't understand this. This patient that you're working with just has an alternative lifestyle, and you know, we don't want to be oppressive with him. Well, he was bipolar or having a manic episode, and he was skateboarding down a 4-lane highway at rush hour. So Foucault was wasted on that particular social worker. But nevertheless, actually, I do think that some social workers do have a background, and that it does influence many times for the good in their work. So there's some interesting articles about that. Speaking of other areas that I would like to see philosophical practitioners explore, education is certainly one of them, working in educational institutions, but I'm hoping that some younger philosophers, a lot younger than I am, who have more energy, will work with police ethics, because that is such a big, big area. Criminal justice ethics. I mean, we have to do something about these incidents that are happening in our country. I don't know whether that's a national problem, but or an international problem, but I suspect it probably is. And we really need to do some work with in that area. There's one philosopher, African, you would remind me, I can't think of his name, Lou, but who works with the military. And of course, this Korean.
Yes. ICPE.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. And I think, is he in Botswana, or I forget exactly where. Definitely, he's done work with the military in sub-Saharan Africa. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah,
and
I know Korean philosophers are working with the military too. And I think some of the decision procedures and leadership techniques that they're using with the military would be very useful for addressing questions of deadly force and so forth with our police forces in the United States, or abusing that.
Yeah, and closer to home, we can talk to our Dutch colleagues, because they've also done a lot of work with the Dutch police force. So again, we can learn from others and then attempt to replicate that here, where it certainly is needed. Julia, thank you very much.
Yes, thank you.
Contribution. Stefania has been very patient. So Stefania, buonasera, please unmute. Go ahead.
Hello, good evening. Oh, good afternoon, Lou and Vaughana. Vaughana, I think your life, you as a person, is a kind of such a value for all of us. And maybe one other approach in creating some kind of a personal inheritance to future generations, because maybe this is what has been suggested by Lydia and then Patrizia and Rick. I don't know, since you are a philosopher, maybe it could be more as a dialogue, and maybe more like a transcription of your narration of your life. Maybe somebody could write your biography, and I think it would be quite a luminous window on a world that is not very known by the large domain of the public. So this is my my adding to this, and also I'm kind of connecting with the last comments by you about education, and Julia was also mentioning philosophy with children. I've been experimenting here in Arezzo, in Italy, in Tuscany, with the model of Matthew Lipman, and it's quite emotional, I was saying. and rewarding to see how even 6 years old children can engage in incredible, fantastic topics that are quite stimulating, even, for my mind. And I was wondering if it's something that you have approached, and how is also in the States, because I'm thinking of awfully moving to California, but I can't find any equivalent approach in the schools, for instance, in the elementary school or middle school, secondary school. I don't even know if they teach history of philosophy in higher school as we do in Italy. Thank you, Vaughana.
I don't know much about that. I know there are people that are teaching various philosophy courses in high schools, but I don't know about California at all. That's very interesting that you're working with AIDS patients. That's a very interesting field. I did a little work with that, not with children, but with adults. And so there's some very interesting work to be done there. There's so many interesting areas, and thank you very much for, I don't think anybody wants to write my biography. You're all very flattering, but no, but in any event, I'm trying to do some new projects right now. One is that I'm looking at nonprofit structures, which will support a lot more cooperation between disciplines. And I have a farm, 78-acre farm here in New Jersey, and I use part of it for environmental work. I do philosophy of nature courses and so forth, and but I'm also looking at combining this with equine therapy and things of that sort. So, and I'd like to see some more in-person programs that and do pilot programs that can be replicated elsewhere. So I'm looking at some projects with that, but first I want to look at a nonprofit structure. There's quite a few animal sanctuaries now that are doing interesting environmental work as well, but they have I can see where they could have a philosophical component. So I'm looking at the business end of this also to see, because I think it's important that for philosophers to have some kind of viable profession where they can, do their work, interact with other disciplines, and yet still be able to fund their programs. So, and I think there's a lot of work that could be done with children and with AIDS people in those kinds of contexts too. So
also, Vaughana, I would suggest environmental psychology. Include that in possibly the vision. They would like to work with you.
okay, that's interesting. That's interesting. Okay. Let me know.
Thank you, Julia. That is interesting. And Stefania, the original work by Matt Lipman was done close to us here on the East Coast in Montclair State, New Jersey, as you know, Montclair State University. But it was gradually taken over by the education people, and it's been transformed into something, a little bit less philosophical than Matthew had intended, because I think it was the failure of success. The children were they were taking these kids that you described, 5, 6 years old, and turning them into relentless Socratic inquirers. And then they were going home and questioning their parents and questioning the other teachers in other classes. And, they were being philosophers, but it began to disturb some of the regimentation, and the system in this country grinds people down rather than uplifts them. And so I think they encountered some problems. But we're all troublemakers here. We're all capable of it. So thank you for reminding us of that. Vaughana, we're at 5:31. It's usually time to begin wrapping up, if not to wrap up, but there's been so much engagement with you. I would like to give someone else a chance who hasn't spoken today. If someone else would like to jump in. Sarah's waving her real hand.
Sarah.
Okay, Sarah, please unmute yourself. I'm looking for you. There you are. Unmute yourself, please. Jump in.
Yeah, I really wanted to speak to the this book project idea that everybody's been encouraging you to do, and I have an idea that I think would be a good idea. Would be less labor intensive for you, and it would give someone else a chance also to do something really enjoyable. I think the book should be structured as a series of interviews, kind of like Lou has this book, The Inner Philosopher. I believe that's interviews, and each interview could be on a different topic, like philosophy in prison, philosophy with the homeless, you name it, and yeah, it could be kind of like Brian McGee. He has the great philosophers that. He had that BBC program. He interviews a different philosopher, like one on Plato, Martha Nussbaum on Aristotle, John Searle on Wittgenstein, and so on. But this could be just you, one interview per topic.
What am I going to do with you all? I'm going to be spending my whole life in front of a computer screen if I listen to you all.
Thank you, Sarah. Thanks for
you though, Sarah.
Suggestion to give Vaughana even more to think about and do. She's obviously not busy enough yet. Vaughana, it's been wonderful having this chance to interact with you, in a more general and personal way and in a non-academic way. And you can see from the interactions how everyone is so enamored of what you have done and the model that you are continuing to be for us. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you for having me. It's been I have enjoyed your questions and seeing you all again. And I hope to meet some more of you that I don't know as well in future sessions. So thank you so much. It's been a joy. I love you all. Keep up the good work.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Oh, don't you want to take a picture like you always do?
I do, Rick, but I always wait for you to remind me because Vaughana, thank you so much. I look forward to following up. And all of you, thank you once again for your participation today. It's been wonderful to see everybody. Take good care.
Thank you.
Until we meet again. Okay, so long. Bye-bye for now. Be safe and well.
Bye.
Okay.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.